This is the Crane M2 gimbal by Zhiyun. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but either way, this is the Crane M2. And I had never had any need or desire to own a gimbal before because most of the video shooting that I do is either on a tripod or maybe from a drone, something like that. But shortly after Christmas, B&H put this on sale for $199. It's normally $269, but I got it for $199, no sales tax and free shipping. And I gotta say, I'm actually really happy with it. I'm really impressed with how it works, and at $199, it's really kind of impossible to complain. This gimbal, the Crane M2, is made for cameras that weigh less than about 1.5 pounds. So anything from, say, an iPhone to a point-and-shoot camera like this, all the way up to maybe a small mirrorless camera. In my case, I'm using it with the Sony RX100 VII. So this footage here was shot just this last weekend. I was on a hike on some very rugged terrain, as you can see, but the gimbal really hides it, because if I had shot this normally, even with the camera's built-in image stabilization, it would have been all over the place. My arms were flailing around as I was trying to keep my balance on the rocks, and it was extremely rugged, but in this footage it looks very smooth. All you really notice is just a little bit of bobbing up and down, as you walk, because the cadence of walking tends to cause gimbal footage to have a little bit of up and down bobble. Other than that, though, it takes out all of the rotations and the tilting, and it really makes for very, very good looking footage. So the first cool thing about the Crane M2 is that it comes with this really nice foam storage box. And it's made out of a foam that's very similar to like pool noodle foam. It's rigid, but it's soft enough that you can keep all of the bits and pieces in here and they're not going to get damaged. It holds everything in there real securely and tightly. The only problem with it is that when you close it, the lid is only held shut by friction alone. There's no latch of any sort on here to keep the lid from opening. So what I did is I went and I got this flexible piece of Velcro strap, and I strapped this around there, and that will keep it shut. The other problem is that the hinge itself is just a piece of plastic. So there's no telling how many times I'll be able to open and close this before that hinge just snaps right off. But once again, it's not a big deal because I'll still be able to use the lid, and I'll just use my strap to keep everything together. So the gimbal itself is really well built. It's got a really good quality feel to it. Yes, there are plastic pieces on it, but the important parts like the gimbal arms up here are made out of metal, and even the plastic bits still have a really good quality feel about them. Overall, this thing weighs just under 2 pounds with my Sony RX100 on it. So that's not a bad weight. I can hold my arm out for pretty good amounts of time without getting too tired. It's a nice sturdy piece of equipment, very well built. And like most gimbals these days, it has a removable bit right here, which folds out to become a tripod. Very useful for when you need to set up the camera, do the initial balancing and stuff like that. When you're putting the gimbal away, you have to lock everything down, and they did this in a really good way. So first, to lock this little rotating part, there's a little red switch, and you just give it a twist and it locks into place, and now that's there. This part, well, I should say these parts, these are still flying around pretty freely, and you don't want that to happen. But what they did was pretty ingenious. There is a pin at the bottom here, and what happens is, when this part is lowered into the grooves on the top, that pin gets shot up through the middle, and it causes this top part to lock. So the grooves on the bottom here hold this arm in place. The pin that shot up is holding this part in place. So once we've got it all locked down, nothing moves, it's all locked together. So the gimbal also comes with this carrying strap. Now, it's a carrying strap that I would never in a million years use to actually carry the gimbal. The strap itself is fine. I mean, it's a nice piece of fake leather, But the problem is the way it connects to the gimbal is by this teeny little narrow piece of thread. And it loops through a little hole right here. But there's no way I'm going to trust 2 pounds and $2,000-ish worth of gear with this tiny piece of thread. So I don't think this was actually meant to carry the gimbal. I think this is more of a safety strap is my guess. If you have this strap on and it's connected and you're using this over the Grand Canyon or something and you accidentally drop it, it'll probably save you. But I would not strap this strap to your belt or anything and carry the gimbal around that way. So as with any gimbal, the camera needs to be perfectly balanced on it in order for the gimbal to work properly and smoothly. And by perfectly balanced, I mean it can't flop in any direction. You have to basically align this thing such that no matter what you do, the camera doesn't move. There are a million other videos out there that talk about how to do balancing on this particular gimbal or any other gimbal for that matter, so I'm not going to go and repeat all that information here. But what I will say is that there are a few things worth noting about balancing. For one, this gimbal has a quick release plate, so the camera slides right off just like that, and then I can reattach it whenever I want and it'll maintain that same balancing. I won't have to touch anything. The problem, however, is really with this mounting plate, the quick release plate. This is the only plate that the gimbal comes with. And this plate is designed for any type of camera, whether it's a small point and shoot like this or whether it's a larger mirrorless camera. There are 2 slots on the bottom. The small slot is for the small cameras like this, and then the larger slot is for the larger cameras. I really wish that they had done 2 separate plates for the 2 different sizes of cameras instead of the one plate, because on this camera, it means I've always got this enormous L-shaped piece of metal sticking out, and it makes it kind of annoying. It means I can't really leave this bracket on here. On most of my other cameras, I leave quick release plates on there so that I can just pop them onto whatever, at any point in time. But with this, it's not really practical, so I'm constantly having to remove the bracket. And when you remove it and you put the bracket back on, it means that you have to rebalance this axis. It would be the x-axis of the gimbal, because once it's off there and you put it back on, every ½ millimeter makes a difference on the balancing. Additionally, when you do remove it, unlike a normal quick release plate, the thumb screw is not actually attached to the plate. It's a separate piece. It comes off. It's very easy to lose it, so you always have to keep track of it. So anyway, it's really just the one little thing that I wish that they had designed a little bit better. It would have been nice to have had a smaller mounting bracket that I could just leave on here. So the other arms also have to be balanced, and they do a few things here. So on this piece right here, on this arm, there is it's just like a little set screw to basically remember where your balance point was. So when you're storing this, you have to move the arm up, right? So we've moved it up and we've done this. When we are unlocking it and we pull it back out, all we have to do is move the arm to where that set screw is, because that's where we set it when it was balanced. So now we know that part is balanced without any effort at all. Similarly, this little piece right here that also has to be balanced, that only gets done once when you first set this up with your camera. Once you've set that in place, you'll never have to touch that again. I haven't touched that since the day that I bought this. Now on the bottom here, this one's a little bit more problematic because this arm comes in and out. And this is the part that you use when you're balancing on this axis. So when you're holding the gimbal like this, you don't want the camera flopping around. And so you do the balancing by moving this arm in and out. That's all fine. You would think, okay, I'm going to set it and I'm done, never have to touch it again. That would be true if you never put this thing back into the storage box. With the arm out, it will not fit back into the space in the storage box. So unfortunately, every time you put it away, you have to unlock it and move the arm all the way back in, and you lose your balance point. So the Crane M2 also has built-in Wi-Fi. And what that allows you to do is to control most cameras using the record button down here and the zoom switch down here. Generally, it works pretty well, and it's quite easy to pair your camera to the gimbal. You just use the ZY Play app. You use it once, tell it where the camera's Wi-Fi network is, and the gimbal will remember it every single time. So you just power these things up, and it'll connect, and it will just work. That being said, there is one major flaw, and it's not a flaw with the gimbal itself. It's a problem with the Sony cameras. So the Sonys have a problem with power management and 4K video. When you turn on Wi-Fi on this camera and you're shooting 4K video, it dims the screen to its minimum setting. Presumably that's to keep it from overheating and conserve power. When you're shooting outdoors, however, and the screen is at its minimum setting of -2, it's impossible to see anything on the screen, so there's no way to tell what you're shooting. It's unfortunate, and because of that, I never use the Wi-Fi connectivity on this thing. I just press the record button manually and do the zooming manually because I just can't see anything on the screen. Even indoors, it's a little bit too dim. So it's a nice feature. It probably works fine with other cameras that don't have this slight issue, but it's pretty cool. The only other issue I have with the way that the Wi-Fi works, it's not really the Wi-Fi works, it's the way the controls work, is the zoom switch itself. Now, unlike a normal video camera, it's not a rocker switch, it's a slider switch. And it's really awkward to use. It just doesn't feel right. It's very difficult when you're holding this thing properly to use that as a switch. I really do wish it was a rocker switch. But other than that, the functionality is there. It works well. Sony just needs to fix their screen brightness problem. So the gimbal has 6 different modes, and I'll talk about each one of those modes in a moment. But the user interface for getting to those modes is a little bit confusing. Actually, it's a lot confusing. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world. For example, down here we have the M button. M button is for mode. You would think that the mode button does all of the modes, but it doesn't. When you boot the gimbal up, it starts in PF mode. That's pan follow mode. If you tap it again, you get into locking mode. Tap it again, you're in POV mode. Tap it again, well, you're back in pan follow mode. But if you double tap it, you're now in go mode. If you double tap it again, you're now in vortex mode. Tap it again, back in pan follow. Now there's a trigger on the back. If you double tap the trigger, it resets the gimbal back to its default pan follow mode. If you hold the trigger down, it goes into follow mode. If you tap the trigger once, it goes in and stays into follow mode. If you triple tap the trigger, it goes into selfie mode. It spins it around 180 degrees. So as you can see, it's pretty complicated getting to all these modes. You have to remember what double taps, triple taps, single taps get you into what. But once you've memorized it, it's not horribly complicated, and it does make a little bit of sense why things were separated out. But it would have been a whole lot better had there been separate buttons for many of these different modes. So first let's talk about pan follow mode. Now pan follow mode is the default mode, and it's the mode that you're most likely to be using most of the time, because what it does is it keeps the camera perfectly level. I can rock it back and forth, it doesn't rotate at all. I can go forward and backwards, it doesn't pitch up and down. All it does is when I rotate the gimbal, it smoothly causes the camera to follow. And you can adjust that a little bit using this thumb screw, so if you do need to tilt up, you can push up and you can push down, and it'll move the camera around. But this mode is great because it just keeps the camera stable and it keeps it level on the horizon. Now what follow mode does is basically exactly the same as pan follow mode, except now when you tilt up and down, the camera does tilt up and down as well. So when you rotate left and right, the camera pans left and right. When you go up and down, it does tilt up and down. But it does not roll. It still keeps the camera perfectly level with the horizon. So go mode is exactly the same as follow mode, except that it reacts a whole lot faster. So now, when I move the gimbal, you can see just how fast it's reacting. Up, down, left, right. This is useful for action shots. So in this example here, I've got my dog and one of his friends, and they're running around, and I was running around too, chasing them. And as you can see, it kept everything smooth, everything level, but yet it was able to quickly react to trace their movement. POV mode is the mode where the gimbal will track all of your motions. So if I tilt up, it goes up. I tilt down, it goes down. Right, left, and also the rotation. So now you basically point the camera, the gimbal, wherever you want it to go, and it will smooth out all of those motions. Now locking mode works a little bit differently. What it does is it keeps the camera aimed in whatever direction you set. So when you turn locking mode on, whatever direction the camera is aiming, it's going to stay that way. No matter what I do to the gimbal, I can twist it, I can turn it, I can rotate it, but the camera will always remain looking exactly along the vector that I set it. And this is useful for, say, tracking modes where you're moving sideways along something and you just want the camera to remain aimed in that specific direction. It'll keep aiming that way no matter what kind of bumps or turns you hit. So Vortex Mode is accessed by double tapping the M button twice. First time gets you into Go mode, second time gets you into Vortex Mode. And what it does is it rotates the camera to be on the same axis as the gimbal arm itself. And what you do is you can use the thumb switch here to rotate the camera. And what this is cool for are shots like this, when you want to hold the gimbal horizontally. You get some really cool, just kind of fun shots with the camera spinning around. But there's one problem, and you may notice it in the video here, which is that the camera wobbles. The video kind of wobbles around. And the reason for that is that it's pretty unlikely that the center of your camera's lens axis is going to be in line with the gimbal axis. So there's a bit of a wobble motion. And unfortunately, there's no way around that because the camera has to be set up this way in order to be properly balanced. So unfortunately, you get a little bit of wobble, but still, it's a pretty cool effect. Now, selfie mode isn't technically another mode, but you access it by triple tapping the trigger. What it does is it just rotates the camera around 180 degrees, so, well, it's basically selfie mode, right? But it doesn't actually change modes. The mode always remains the same. So I was in pan follow mode, I'm still in pan follow mode. I can access this 180 degree rotation from pretty much all the other modes just by triple tapping. And if I triple tap again, it returns the camera back. So we'll call this kind of a half mode, but either way, it's a cool feature to have. So the battery life of the Crane M2 is outstanding. I have not recharged this thing in weeks, and I've been using it extensively. I mean, I've been on multiple hikes. I've been recording this video all morning long with it on, and it's still at 3 bars. They say that it'll go 8 hours on a charge, and I don't doubt that for a second because I've never seen the battery drop on this thing. I think I've only recharged it twice since I've owned it, and even then it was only just out of the sake of recharging it for the sake of recharging it. But anyway, the battery life is excellent. Additionally, up here there's a little tiny USB power port that you can use to power your camera from the battery in the gimbal. One little problem with that, at least when using the Sony RX100, which is that when this camera is properly balanced like it is now, the door on the camera where the USB power input would be is being blocked. There's no way to open it. There's certainly no way to get a cable in there. And the irony of that is that if you look in the instruction manual for the Crane M2, they are clearly using a Sony RX100, and they're showing a power cable come out and go into that little port. But it's physically impossible to do that. The only way it would work is if the camera was pushed way, way back. You'd have to have a really heavy lens on the front or something, or if you had a camera with the power jack on the other side. Earlier I mentioned the ZY Play app for mobile devices. You know, it's the app that allows you to pair the camera to the gimbal over Wi-Fi. Well, it ends up that the ZY Play app can also be used to control the gimbal directly, at least in theory. The problem is I've never gotten it to work. When I connect the app to my gimbal, it brings up a screen with a bunch of controls. The only control that seems to do anything is the roll control. I can adjust this on the phone and it causes the gimbal to roll the camera. But these other buttons, which look like they should pan the gimbal or rotate the gimbal in one way or the other, or up, down, left, right, don't do anything. I'm not sure if I'm doing something wrong or if it's just broken, but as far as I can tell, it does not work. So, in conclusion, I really do like the Crane M2. I think it's a fantastic piece of gear, especially for $199. I mean, even if I had paid the full price of $279, I still think this is a great thing to have. Now, am I actually going to use this thing out in the real world? I think it's probably pretty unlikely. I mean, I'm not going to take this on vacation with me. It's just too big. It takes too long to set up the camera on it. And quite honestly, I would feel way too self-conscious walking around with this thing like this. You know, when you walk around with a normal camera, nobody pays any attention to you, but you walk around with a piece of gear like this, and I don't know, people look at you funny. So it's unlikely I would ever do that. But, you know, for specific uses, if I'm making a specific video and I need moving footage of something, sure, I'll get this out and set it up. It's great. I mean, I think it really works well. So it's just a good accessory to have on hand. I highly recommend it. Minor flaws, no big deal. You know, for 269 bucks, you can't go wrong. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Reindeer.